All right, so Bernie Sanders gave a really important address yesterday at George Washington University, and I actually did do a long stream on this yesterday on my channel, and I'll try to elaborate some of those points and maybe find some new ones. I think, and which one? You're starting with one. Okay. This is actually really, really important part of the speech. And, there's a huge amount of substance in it, and it is incredibly important. I'd recommend everybody read Harvey J.K. It is important, particularly as just a matter of practical politics, to embrace that FDR legacy in the context of a Democratic primary. And in fact, very disappointingly, even Elizabeth Warren in this Atlantic piece laughed at the idea of democratic socialism, which
she also stood up to clap Trump when he said we'll always be a capitalist country or whatever he said.
Yes, so. Which is a disaster. And it's a disastrous way of conceiving the world, and it's a limitation on your sense of democratic possibility and serious accountability, which will undermine even good technocratic reforms. And so, as far as that part of the speech goes, the question for all the other Democrats is, do you support completing the New Deal or not? Forget your snarkiness and historical illiteracy about the term democratic socialism. Do you support completing the Economic Bill of Rights, which coalesces with the agenda that Bernie Sanders put on the table going back to 2016 and is banged on for decades? In 1944, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt basically said, in order to, in reality, in actual real world, to realize the liberties that are enshrined in the Constitution, you need an economic and material base for it. And without an economic and material base, those are false promises. And Bernie put that across very well. And he also looped it with the fact that, as we see, the hatred of Bernie Sanders from the corporate class, from the political class, it makes sense why, the worst people in the Democratic Party, the people who run Center for American Progress, the Democratic leaders, the people who've been having this model that has worked for them professionally for decades, but has mostly actually been a critical failure for the Democratic Party. And of course, God forbid, its most necessary constituencies, poor people, working people, people of color, in many key areas. That they hate this guy. And, one of the reasons that I find it so mystifying and bizarre that, people, for example, who are, frankly not part of the oligarchy buy into the propaganda against him is because you're doing the job of other people who don't generally share your interests, and it's incredibly self-defeating. And even where the legitimate criticisms of Bernie, they frankly come from a very left position that is not represented by any other candidate. And so, Bernie is going to go back to the classic FDR quote here about the real forces that he's up against: Wall Street, Silicon Valley, pharmaceutical, health insurance, much of the leadership of the Democratic Party, of course, the Republican Party. And he's going to echo Roosevelt in exactly how he rightly feels about it.
Like today, the quest for transformative change was opposed by big business, by Wall Street, by the political establishment, by the Republican Party, and by the conservative wing of FDR's own Democratic Party. And he faced the same scare tactics then that we experience today: red baiting, xenophobia, racism, and anti-Semitism. In a famous 1936 campaign speech, Roosevelt stated, and I quote, "We had to struggle with the old enemies of peace: business and financial monopoly, speculation, reckless banking, class antagonism, sectionalism, war profiteering." They had begun to consider the government of the United States as a mere appendage to their own affairs. We know now that government by organized money is just as dangerous as government by organized mob. And Roosevelt concluded, and I quote, "Never before in all our history have these forces been so united against one candidate as they stand today. They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred."
Boom.
That was FDR in 1936. Now, although it does sound, I must say it does sound a little contemporary, doesn't it? Despite that opposition, by rallying the American people, FDR and his progressive coalition created the New Deal, won 4 terms, and created an economy that worked for all and not just the few.
So this is really, really important. And again, I think he's exactly right about the forces that are up against him and also the fundamental distinction between his position in this race and others. It's a difference, as Ben Burgess said, it's not a question even of better, it's just a different kind. And then he's going to go on and outline his plan for economic freedoms and their importance.
Freedom is an often used word, but it is time that we took a hard look at what that word actually means. Ask yourself, what does it really mean to be free? Are you truly free if you are unable to go to a doctor when you are sick, or face financial bankruptcy when you leave the hospital? Are you truly free if you cannot afford the prescription drugs you need in order to stay alive? Are you truly free when you spend half of your limited income on housing and are forced to borrow money from a payday lender at 200% interest rates? Are you truly free if you are 70 years old and forced to work because you lack a pension or enough money to retire? Are you truly free if you are unable to go to a college or a trade school because your family lacks the income? Are you truly free if you are forced to work 60 or 80 hours a week because you cannot find a job that pays you a living wage? Are you truly free if you are a mother with a newborn baby, but you are forced to go back to work immediately after the birth of that child because you lack paid family leave? Are you truly free if you are a small business owner or a family farmer who is driven out of business by the monopolistic practices of big business? Are you truly free if you are a veteran who has put his or her life on the line to defend this country and tonight will be sleeping out on the streets?
This is so important and it's so basic. There's no substance to those other freedoms without the material base. And and again, this is another very important way and linking with the fight for every category of liberation and against the bigotry and white supremacy. There's a reason also that Bernie Sanders centered so much of this in the 30s. And there's a reason why we look at great leaders like Nelson Mandela or Olof Palme in that broader democratic socialist tradition, because they were some of the only players who made all of the major calls right about authoritarianism and fascism. And yes, there is a vitally important American tradition here, including, by the way, quoted extensively from Dr. King, that is democratic socialism. The civil rights movement was a two-sided movement, one hand to end American apartheid and legal discrimination. It was also to complete the New Deal by stripping away the compromises with the Dixiecrats and making it universal protections for all forms of labor and all forms of social delivery. So, and there's a radical tradition of Debs, who is, of course, Sanders' hero. And then there is, even with the historical complexities, the hugely important accomplishments of the New Deal. So it was very disheartening. You know, the Atlantic caught up with his rivals, and they said, as Bernie Sanders leans into socialism, his rivals laugh. Waterloo, Iowa, making Elizabeth Warren laugh can be tricky. Throwing her off her talking points is almost impossible, but both happened when she heard that her 2020 opponent, Bernie Sanders, was scheduled to deliver a major address today, according to his campaign, entitled "How Democratic Socialism is the only way to defeat oligarchy and authoritarianism." The Massachusetts senator shook her head. It was Sunday evening. We were standing in the backyard of the house in a poorer side of town, and it goes on. She's making her spiel. And then she says, I'll have to hear the speech, she said diplomatically. And, you know, she kind of brushed it off and said, I have to hear it, I have to hear it. But her first response is to laugh. And then we go in descending order. They asked, you know, Hickenlooper and Bannon. I don't even know why they would. You know, they're irrelevant. Kamala Harris simply said, huh? And so on.
Ask your dad, Kamala.
Yeah, ask your dad if you're confused. He would have some expertise on this. But the thing about, you know, or maybe he might not want to speak. But the thing about this is that it's campaign stuff and it's juvenile and whatever, but they're not just rejecting Bernie Sanders. They're not just rejecting the absolute necessity when you talk about real human beings that need these policies. I mean, it's disgusting. If you have any sense of actual people in your life that need Medicare for all, that's not a luxury, it's not a negotiation, that need massive debt cancellation, that need a structural approach to fighting racism and xenophobia and fascism, which Sanders also outlined. Yes, it's offensive that they would dismiss that, but it's a historical illiteracy that rejects their own party and tradition. I mean, how many, you know, FDR dinners are these candidates going to? What's your position? Are you, you know, do you want to live out in 2019 and include, of course, the, you know, and build on the legacy of A. Philip Randolph and Martin Luther King Jr. and Eugene Debs and FDR for a fully realized 21st century American social democracy and full democracy for all human beings here, because that's the only way it will work? Or are you, you know, the inheritors of, in, you know, Pete Buttigieg's case, he's a former McKinsey guy, as we talked about earlier. That was his first gig out of college. The post-1970s technocracy, corporate tinkering strain. Or if you're really going to aggressively reject, you know, the FDR legacy, well, you're on the right-wing part of the party that Bernie said in the beginning, and you would have been on the wrong side of everything that we need, from Medicare, Social Security, civil rights legislation, and so on. So, you know, pathetic. Pathetic to laugh at it when you are denying the history and you also don't have your own philosophical architecture to hang a broader argument around about who and what we should be in this country.